হ্যাঁ আছেন।
Well, very good afternoon to all my dear participants, our Honorable Principal Sir, Professor Sharmila Majumdar from the University of Kalyani, and my dear students and my colleagues. Well, we have been doing this for quite the time now, since there's no help in the outside world for a real life, a physical seminar. So we have all taken to the cyberspace for the time being. And as things are going on, it's going on quite well. We have, in our limited capacity, tried to arrange all that we could have done. That is for our students, for our colleagues, and all the fellow journeymen in the unending sea of literature and English language. And before I begin, that is before the webinar proper actually begins, I'd like to sort of express my gratitude towards the authority and the governing body of our beloved Nabadwip Vidyasagar College, our Honorable Principal Sir, to Sharmila Di, that is our most respected and beloved Professor Sharmila Majumdar from the University of Kalyani, a teacher to many of us, that is our teacher, that is. And also to the technical support, to the technical team of Nabadwip Vidyasagar College, and all the people in the department, including the students who have made this happen. Well, so much for introductions. There's a pandemic of COVID-19 raging all around us, and it has affected our livelihood, our society, our psyche in a bigger sense. And that very effect is also reflected in the title of our webinar, which is namely the pandemic in the texts and contexts. Well, without further ado, I would like to transfer the mic to our honorable Principal Sir to give the welcome address to the people present and to the people who are watching this on cyberspace. Well, the mic's to you, sir.
Thank you, Rupen. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, the Department of English and the IQAC are jointly organizing this state-level webinar. The title of the webinar is Pandemic and Literature, Text and Context. The term pandemic has become a household name. Pandemic, and economics, pandemic and literature. So the title of our state-level webinar is The Pandemic and Literature, Text and Context. It is my great pleasure and privilege to extend my warm welcome to our renowned, to our distinguished speaker, Professor Sharmila Majumdar, who is associated with the Department of English, Kalyani University. Perhaps her enjoyable and knowledgeable speech will enrich and enlighten the participants, and we will be also enriched and enlightened by the deliberations to be given by our beloved speaker, Professor Sharmila Majumdar. Thank you, Madam, for accepting our invitation, and you have agreed to speak on the topic Pandemic in Literature, English and Bengali. Thank you from the end of Nabadwip Vidyasagar College, and also from the end of Department of English, Nabadwip Vidyasagar College. The organizing secretaries, those are Dr. Arun Kumar Biswas, Departmental Head, Nabadwip Vidyasagar College, Department of English, Professor Piyush Bhadro, Professor Dipanjan Ghosh, and Professor Rupen Mondol. They are the secretaries of the organizing committee. I also express my thanks and gratitude to all of them for organizing such a state level webinar. I also thank uh, coordinator Dr. Bhaskar Chatterjee, who is also the coordinator of internal quality assurance now at the Vidyasagar College. He is always with us. He gives his suggestion, his advice, and accordingly, we actually thank Professor Dr. Shankar Bhaskar Chatterjee. Next comes President Governing Body, Sri Biman Krishna Saha. He is actually we express our thanks and gratitude to our Honorable President Sri Biman Krishna Saha. His inspiration, his encouragement is always with us. We hope that the webinar will be a successful one. And lastly, I want to mention that the participants, if the participants are satisfied by the deliberations given to be given by the by Professor Sharmila Majumdar, Associate Professor, Department of English, I will think, or I may think that the webinar will be a great successful one. Thank you all again. Thank you, Professor Sharmila Majumdar, because you have given your consent. You have agreed to speak on uh, pandemic in literature, English and Bengali. Thank you all. Thanks. Over to Professor Rupen Mondol.
Network anyway. Sir, you have thanked us all, and you have sort of shown expressed your gratitude, which is also vice versa, because without your help, your participation and your leadership, this couldn't have ever happened, because the kind of initiative that you have taken in these COVID months about electronic teaching in the e-media learning and all this, it's a laudable kind of thing, sir, and we are very happy to have you with us and leading us as always. And for the next thing that's going to go on in this webinar, I would like to hand the mic over to Professor Arun Kumar Biswas. He is going to introduce our speaker, our honorable speaker for the day. Well, Arunda, this is all for you.
Okay, thank you, Rupen. And our respected principal, sir. Okay, I think I'm audible. Good afternoon to all the participants and our renowned, respected resource person, Professor Sharmila Majumdar, who is the chief speaker of this webinar, which is organized by the Department of English in collaboration with IQS in Nabadwip Vidyasagar College. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce to all of you with Professor Sharmila Majumdar, the only speaker of today's webinar. First off, primarily, she is Professor Majumdar is my PhD supervisor in the Department of English, Kalyani University. Professor Majumdar is currently holding the post of Associate Professor in the Department of English, Kalyani University. She has also acted as HOD in the Department of English in Kalyani University several times. She's also an active chairperson of the Board of Studies UG Council, Kalyani University. She's not only a good administrator, but also a good academician with a friendly as well as amiable personality. That's why she's one of the few persons I like ever most. Okay, apart from her professional and academic and guidance and supervisions of PhD and MPhil scholars, she has also published a number of research papers in the journals of national and international merit or repute. She has also attended a number of seminars, conferences, both in India and abroad. So these are the few words of about Professor Sharmila Majumdar. So more words we'll listen listen today from her on the topic of the webinar, which has been entitled, Pandemic and Literature, Text and Context. And it's needless to say that the title of her talk, Professor Sharmila Majumdar's talk is, Pandemic in Literature, English and Bengali. So thank you, ma'am, for joining in this webinar and for your kind, consent to this webinar. So thank you again. I am handing over the microphone to Professor Sharmila Majumdar. Okay. Ma'am?
Thank you for a very generous introduction. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Audible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very generous introduction. And before I start speaking, I must thank Nabadwip Vidyasagar College, the principal, the coordinator of IQAC, and the faculty members, everybody associated with the college to have given me this opportunity to speak. Thank you very much. I only hope that I do justice to the opportunity. So today I decided to talk about pandemic in literature, both in English and in Bangla. First, I will start with English literature. And these pathogens which cause the pandemics, they are probably older than the Homo sapiens. And epidemics are as old as humanity itself and are quite common. It's not that epidemic is something which happens once in a while. The epidemics are quite common in all parts of the world. But pandemic is a relatively rare phenomenon. The difference between an epidemic and a pandemic has been pointed out very wittily by somebody who say that pandemic has a passport, which means that pandemic can actually travel countries and continents. And that is exactly what is happening right now. Now, first I would like to talk about the pandemic of plague in Europe, which lasted for about 2.5 centuries, that is more than 250 years, and can actually be described as the first pandemic in human history, which has been very well recorded, if I may say so. And this pandemic traveled through continents and through countries. The second pandemic that I would like to touch upon is the Spanish flu, which raged between 1918 and 1920. The first pandemic, that is the 14th, 15th, 16th century plague pandemic in Europe, it was Bubonic Plague. The Bubonic Plague is caused by a bacteria, and the Spanish flu was caused by a virus. The virus is very similar to H1N1 virus, which causes swine flu. And episodes of swine flu outbreaking is quite common, and in the sense that it is in recent memory. I think in the first decade of the 21st century, there was a epidemic of swine flu in the United States of America. So first we go to the plague, the bubonic plague, which broke out in Europe in the 14th century. Now, it was in 1347 that bubonic plague arrived in Europe, October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. From here, the Black Death, as it was called the Black Death, spread and killed nearly 20 million people in Europe. 20 million, almost 1/3 of the continent's population. Now, it is believed that the infection of bubonic plague traveled through the trade route, that is India, China, Persia, Syria, Egypt. The entire trade route was affected by this bubonic plague. I am not aware of any historical or literary document in India which has actually mapped this pandemic. There may be several reasons. First of all, England has a hierarchical structure, church hierarchical structure, where each parish recorded deaths and births. In India, we didn't have any such system, and that is why probably the deaths were not recorded, the causes were not recorded, the number of deaths due to a particular cause was not recorded. So I don't have any literary text to cite where this pandemic has been described. Though it is believed that the plague originated in Asia. When we talk about the bubonic plague in Europe, we have fairly good documented history. For example, Shakespeare was born in 1564 on 24th April, and on 26th April, the Holy Trinity Church, the church where Shakespeare is buried right now, recorded a death in the parish, and the priest scribbled within brackets after the name of the death that the plague has arrived. So that is how meticulously records were kept of deaths due to plague. So 20 million people dead that we are talking about. Sorry. Now, devastation on this scale was unseen before, and there are things which have uncanny similarity with the situation that is prevailing now. Devastation on this scale brought out the worst in people. Sorry. Often, it was not the movement of stars that was blamed for the disease, but the minorities in the community. Witches and gypsies were frequently targeted. Jewish people were also tortured and burned to death. Burned to death because they were believed to have carried the bubonic plague infection throughout Europe. And preachers claimed that the disease was God's punishment for immorality. You see similar situations. Minorities are being attacked for being responsible for spreading the disease. Then there are these godmen, holy people, who declare that this pandemic is actually a curse by God. What is the natural reaction? Many people, they turn to prayer. And those that did survive ascribe their good luck to their devotion, resulting in the rise of splinter religion and cults in the aftermath of the pandemic. This is a very interesting and important area and calls for a separate presentation. How splinter religious groups and cults, not necessarily religious, flourished after the pandemic, because each of these groups believed that because of their way of dealing with the pandemic, make them impervious to the infection. The Black Death was terrifyingly indiscriminate and contagious. The mere touching of the clothes It's from Boccaccio, because the first text I will be touching is Decameron. In Decameron, Boccaccio gives detailed description of how the plague wrecked Italy. And he says, it appeared to itself to communicate the malady to the toucher. So even if you touch the clothes of the person who has been infected with bubonic plague and died as a consequence of it, you will be infected. People who were perfectly healthy when they went to bed at night could be dead by morning. And exactly the same kind of reference is there to a 21st century novel by Hilary Mantel called The Old Fall, which was awarded the Booker probably in 2009. Well, so Decameron contains a sinister description of how people behaved, what actually happened, and how people tried to negotiate with the very fact of the disease. Now, let me make something clear. The disease is something physical, but the disease has huge repercussion on social, moral, psychological, and of course financial system, entire system of the country, the nation, the continent which were affected by the plague. And this is something which Professor Sajini Mukherjee wrote. I think it was sometime in May and it was published in Scroll.in, that human nature changed drastically. And that is something that is Boccaccio has also recorded in the Decameron. Every person for himself became the order of the day. And we are talking about how people has been very selfish, cruel, heartless, not very self-centered, not paying attention to what is happening to his neighbors, friends, even family members. So Boccaccio writes, human nature changed drastically. Every person for himself became the order of the day. Some isolated themselves, ate sensibly, and drank very little of only the choicest wine. Others, like a group of people which consisted of Boccaccio and his friends, escaped the world of Florence to pleasanter climate, where they told each other some gripping stories, exercised, and listened to gentle music. So, isolation. Isolation was considered to be an important tool in dealing with the pandemic. And what did rich people? We will have plenty of references to texts where rich people left the city, because cities where you can look at Mumbai, you can look at Delhi, you can look at Bangalore, you can look at Kolkata, and you know how true it is today as it was some 700 years ago. So people isolated themselves, left the city, and went to countryside. That is exactly what Boccaccio did, and all the stories of Decameron were actually the stories told each other, or rather told one another, during this long period of isolation which they spent in the summer. In that eventful year of 1348, doomsday seemed to have arrived in Lawrence. Sense of ending, some, as Boccaccio puts it, adopted a devil-may-care attitude and gave themselves up to more debauchery and loose living than ever before. And taking a cue from Boccaccio, we can move to Canterbury Tales. There is a tale told by the corrupt cardinal, in which three friends appear to have recklessly chosen this path of giving themselves up entirely to a life of sea. So you see, not much hope. No possibility of ever getting rid of the pandemic. So people became desperate. And the idea was enjoy. As long as you live, you enjoy. And that enjoyment inevitably led to some kind of blood. And I'm quoting a few lines of Partner's Tale. It is Nabadwip's translation because I can't read the Middle English. It's in modern English. So he writes, in Flanders, once there was a company of youngsters hunting vice and ribaldry, riot and gambling, stews and public houses, where each with herb, bitter or lewd caryouses. If you remember your history of English literature, Chaucer was sent to Italy on king's business once in 1372 to Genoa, and later in 1372, and later in 1378 to Milan. Also, we have to remember that he was well versed in the writings of Renaissance Italians and was familiar with Decameron. Decameron was written between 1349 and 1353, roughly the plague years in Europe, the first plague years in Europe. Something I find interesting in this tale, that is the Partner's Tale, is the speech of a very old man who is actually dead, and whom the three gamblers went out to seek. So again, I am quoting from Nabadwip's translation. The old fella looked him in the eye and said, "Because I never yet have found, though I have walked to India, searching round village and city, or on any pilgrimage, one who'd change his youth to have my age." Even before, I have already talked about 12 ships that reached Messina with sailors and traders affected with plague. Even before these ships reached Italy, people were talking about a mysterious disease which was killing people by the thousands. They have already heard about it. So India is a very interesting reference and may mean Southeast Asia, which was an important loop in the chain of trade routes. So international travel is responsible for the spread of the pandemic. That's exactly what happened this time also. Shakespeare lived almost his entire life in the shadow of plague. As I was telling you, a few months before his birth in 1564, an outbreak of Bubonic Plague swept across England. In the parish register of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, the vicar on April 26, 1564, just 2 days after Shakespeare was born, wrote in the margin of a particular entry of death. He wrote it in Latin, "Hic incipit pestis," which means here begins the plague. So, plague was pretty common. And as I was telling you, rich people who have had the means, like the poetic persona in Decameron, fled to the country. And the cities, densely populated, physical distancing was difficult. Compared to the cities, countryside offered fresh air, less dirt, filth, and consequently better hygiene. We have to remember, in Shakespeare's time, London was a very unhygienic place with narrow dirt track, no provision for garbage disposal, no proper sewerage, and more people per square mile than is healthy. It is also conjectured that Shakespeare himself particularly left London periodically during these plague outbreaks and spent time in his native Stratford-upon-Avon. I am quoting from Stephen Greenblatt. he wrote an article in the New Yorker on May 7, 2020. Civic officials, realizing that crowds heightened contagion, took measures to institute what now called social distancing. This is Greenblatt writing about London in the 16th century. Collecting data from parish registers, they carefully tracked weekly plague-related deaths, contact tracing. They did it even at that time. When those deaths surpassed 30, they banned assemblies, feasts, archery contests, and other forms of mass gathering. Exactly what in the 21st century we are doing all over the world. So what has changed? Not much. Since it was believed that it was impossible to become infected during the act of worship, church services were not included in the ban, though the infected were not permitted to attend. Uncanny similarity. So religious gatherings were allowed because people believed that when you are worshipping, you can't be infected. You remember your Hamlet? Why didn't Hamlet kill his uncle? Because the first opportunity he got, because he was praying. And so when a man is praying, if he is killed, he will get salvation. And he didn't want his uncle to get salvation. So that was a belief which has been cherished by people through centuries. Even in the 21st century, we believe that if it is a religious congregation, it's fine. People will not be infected. There were particularly severe outbreaks of plague in 1582. 1582, so Shakespeare was 18 years old. Then 1592-93, 1603-4, 1606, and 1608 and 9. So in close successions, waves of plague epidemic swept through England. And again, I am quoting Greenblatt. Theatre historian J. Leeds Barrow concluded that in the years between 1606 and 1610, when Shakespeare wrote and produced some of his greatest plays, from Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, the London playhouses were not likely to have been open for more than a total of 9 months. So maybe out of 36 months, only 9 months the theatres were open. We have to remember that Shakespeare was financially dependent on theatre. And if the theatre didn't run, he must have faced some financial difficulty, like many people in many professions are facing now. All his money came from the theatre. By the middle of his career, he became quite a well-to-do man to buy the Globe Theatre. It would be an accountant's delight. I would like a chartered accountant to kind of audit the balance sheet to calculate how much did Shakespeare earn in 9 months to compensate for 27 months lost during 1606 and 1610. And as I was reading of these things, I had a thought which I would like to share here. Prospero's speech at the end of Tempest, which is sometimes considered to be Shakespeare's farewell to London state, was plague partly responsible? Beloved family member. Money and property was taken over by enterprising doctors. I add a rider, I'm not referring to doctors in the current situation. And lawyers. Anyone who is sick. So people died, and people who were still alive, they, by hook or by crook, managed whatever was left of the dead man's property. The burial scene was the order of the day. So is there anything very different from what is happening right now. As I was telling you, I will have just a small short quotation from Hilary Mantel. I told you Hilary Mantel was awarded Man Booker for her novel Woolfall. It's a trilogy. This book was originally published in 2009. The warm weather has brought sweating sickness to London. And city is empty. City is empty. Where are they going? They are decamping to the suburbs. Gossip in the shops is all about pills and infusions. And friars in the streets are doing a lucrative trade in holy medals. So priests were minting money. They were doing medals which they made them against the pandemic, actually. But they got this plague came to us in the year 1485 with the armies that brought us first ending. Now everywhere it fills the graveyards. It kills in a day. Maybe at breakfast. They die. No, exactly that's what was talking about. That if somebody is when he or she went to bed at night, by morning the person will be dead. So the disposal of dead bodies, that was also something people have talked about, that the dead bodies were flocked into the nearest hole. I was horrified to read a Facebook post by one English literature professor. She teaches at the University of New Mexico in USA. She complained of terrible stench pervading the atmosphere and was looking for its source. One of her Facebook friends, who is local, commented that it is the stench of burnt human bodies. The civic authority, instead of burying the dead, because the dead in New Mexico, they are mostly Christians and should have been buried, are burning the bodies, since it is an easier way of disposing of the dead bodies. This encompasses an entire gamut of cultural history and memory. And I was kind of, what should I say, horrified to learn that people in the USA, they are burning the dead bodies of COVID patients because they didn't have a better means to dispose of the dead bodies. And this Facebook post I read some maybe 10-12 days back. And you know, there are certain common symptoms of the bubonic plague. Victims would awaken with fever and chill. A feeling of extreme weakness or exhaustion would give way to diarrhea, vomiting, bleeding from the mouth, nose, or rectum, and telltale swollen lymph nodes in the groin or armpit. Death, often in great agony, would almost inevitably follow. That is exactly what happened with bubonic plague. When I talk about reference of the plague, bubonic plague in Bangla literature, I will also quote from Srikanto Dityo Porbo, and Sharat Chandra has exactly described how the English doctors were examining people groping their armpit and groin, because the lymph nodes, swollen lymph nodes, could only be found there. Now we are coming to, I was telling you that people devised various ways and means to stop the disease. Innumerable preventive measures were proposed, most of which were useless. And you know, useless because they know the source of the disease, that this was spread by fleas and home fleas. of dried rosemary, frankincense, bay leaves burning in a chafing dish was thought to help clear the air of infection. If those ingredients were not readily available, physicians recommended old shoes that give off the foul smell. In the streets, people walked about sniffing oranges stuffed with cloves, pressed firmly enough against the nose. Perhaps this is performed function of a musk. That is what they believed. And as I was telling you, I'm slightly, not really slightly, I'm technologically challenged. But whoever is interested, you can go to Google and search for plague doctors of the Middle Ages. The dress that these people used, the plague doctors, very closely resembles the PPEs. Only that they have an aquiline nose. The dress, integrated dress, has an aquiline nose. That's the only difference. It's otherwise it's like a PPE. So you know, now I am coming to some of the texts of Shakespeare. As I was reading up for this webinar, I realized that there are more texts that I can actually manage to read within this short period. How does plague appear in Shakespeare's plays, for example? But before going into that, I would like to recite a poem by Thomas Nash, who was almost a contemporary of Shakespeare. The poem is called A Litany in Time of Plague. Rich men, trust not in wealth. Gold cannot buy you well. Physic himself must bed. All things to end are well. The plague full sweet goes by. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. Beauty is but a flower, which wrinkles devour. Brightness falls from the air. Queens have died young and fair. At those heaven's eye, I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy on us. But this is very clear, isn't it? He's talking about plague, how people are infected and dies, and he is invoking the Lord for mercy. Shakespeare didn't do any of these things. In Shakespearean texts, epidemic disease is present for the most part as a steady, low-level undertone, surfacing his characters' speeches most vividly in metaphorical expressions of rage and disgust. Now, I would like to remind you the imagery of disease has been there in many of Shakespeare's plays. And when we were students, we were recommended a book by Carol's Culture, which was called Shakespeare's Imageries and Essays. And there she has given meticulous citation and explanation of how the different images actually add meaning to Shakespearean texts. So I was talking about disease and foul smell is something that go hand in hand with Shakespearean texts. Take for example, here in Act 2, Scene 4, the king has been denied an audience with his elder daughter, and he says, "Let us speak. They are sick. They are weary. Fetch me a better answer." he still believes he is the king, even after he has divided his kingdom. So he wants a better answer. And then Gloucester tells him that that may not be possible. To which Lear says. He was talking about Lear, and when he's very angry with Goneril, he calls her a carbuncle. And if you read the descriptions of the plague-infected patients, they have boils all over their bodies. So definitely indirect reference to the plague, which was such a powerful part of their everyday existence. I will be citing only a few. When he is mortally wounded in the feud between the Capulets and Montagues in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio calls down a plague on both your houses, that is the Capulets and the Montagues. Then, as I was telling you, thou art a boy. Lear tells his daughter Goneril, a sword, an embossed carbuncle, he might corrupt his blood. And in Timon, the misanthropic Timon of Athens tells his visitor, here is gold. He has actually paid when Jove put over some high vice city has poison the sea air. So that is how exactly the plague spread. All the contagion of the south light from you, the shades of hope. How Coriolanus speaks at the Plagiarism. You heard of boils and plagues, plaster you over that you may be abhorred, other than seen, and one infect another against the wind a mile. It was very contagious. So if you by any chance come close to the person who is infected with the disease, you will also be infected. Plagues and appears throughout Shakespeare's work in the form of everyday exclamation. Like in the fourth part one, if I remember correctly, there are at least 10 to 12 references to the plague. I am citing only 3 or 4. A plague among each thieves cannot be true to another. A plague of sighing and grief, it blows a man up like a bladder. A plague upon the howling, a plague of his people hearing. So all these things are there, and people are not using plague only as infection, that particular infection of the bubonic plague which was raging at that point of time. And English, plague is not only a disease or a conglomerate of diseases, conglomerate of symptoms, it's a birth. Plague is a birth also. And it carries the meaning of any widespread affliction, calamity, or evil, especially one regarded as a direct punishment by God. That is how English has been using this word. Remember, I don't have the newspaper today. In today's times of India, there is a news item that COVID patients are plagued. The word plagued various terms even after they recover from COVID and go back home from hospital. I don't remember any other disease which has been as devastating as plague to secure the position of a bird. I don't remember. So, you know, this is how plague has figured in Shakespeare's plays. I will now go over to measure for measure, because plague is not only a disease, plague is not only a destroyer of human values, Plague is huge financial loss. Nobody knows it better than us right now. And I have already talked about how probably Shakespeare lost a lot of money in London theatre before the because the playhouses were closed for very long periods of time. So, in Melbourne, I'm quoting from the introduction. There are good grounds for supposing the metaphor between the theatres closed throughout 1603 reopened on April 1604, and the play was probably performed for the first time in the summer months of that year, 1604. So here I remember a conversation between Mistress O'Dan and Pompey, her servant, in Act 1 and Scene 2 of Metamorphosis. Pompey tells Mistress O'Dan is a brothel keeper. Pompey is her servant. Do you find a similarity in sound between the name Pompey and the word king? You have not heard of the proclamation, have you? Mistress O'Dan, what proclamation, man? Pompey, all houses in the suburbs of Vienna must be plucked down. If you remember, Metaphor Major was located in Vienna, but all the details are the details of London. Mr. Soberdan, what shall become of those in the city? Pompey, they shall stand for seat. They had gone down too, but that a wise burgher put in for them. That is, all the brothels will be broken down, because you know brothels were the places where lots of people frequented, large gatherings, and possibility of spreading the disease was highest in these brothels. So Mr. Soberdan, but shall all our houses of resort in the suburbs be pulled down? Houses, resorts, these are euphemisms for brothel houses. Pompey, to the ground, mistress. Mr. Soberdan, why? Here is a change in the Commonwealth. What shall become of me now? You can see loss of income for her, financial distress if the brothels are pulled down. And this proclamation that the Pompey is talking about was dated September 16, 1603. It called for the pulling down of houses and homes in the suburbs of London as a precaution against the spread of the plague by dissolving and idle persons. The measure, which was strictly enforced during the following months, bore heavily upon the numerous brothels and gaming houses which proliferated on the outskirts of the city. So lots of trade livelihood is very real. As it was 400 years ago, Pompey's speech is full of equivocation and probably talks of a camouflage to be provided by one wise burgher who would take over a brothel, and it will not be known as a brothel, and present it as a domestic place, a seat that is what Pompey is talking about, from which, when the restrictions are withdrawn, other brothels will jump in. And he consoles Mr. Soberdan. Fear not, good counselors lack no times. Though you change your place, you need not change your place. I will be your tapster still. Courage. There will be you that is almost out in the service, you will be considered. So, a woman who is afraid of losing livelihood, and a servant who is putting up a very brave front to console the mistress that the trade will be less, but trade will not be lost, and these restrictions will not last forever, and there will be time when people will come to this. So, as I was telling you, the reference to disease and foul smell, they are linked to each other, and they are like natural corollaries. That is how find in Shakespeare's plays. And among the main symptoms of plague were boils and carbuncles, which made festering wounds on human bodies that emanated from skin. So plague was inevitably associated with women. And you know, I think we all are familiar with the nursery rhyme, "Ringa Ringa Roses," which children play. They hold each other's hand, they make a circle, they recite the nursery rhyme in a chorus, and when the nursery rhyme ends, they all fall down. Many scholars have argued that it is actually a reference to plague. So, "Ringa Ringa Roses," pocket full of posies. These posies are not rosebuds. These are bundles of herbs people carried around with them in the hope of staving off the illness, and also to protect themselves from the stench of festering bodies. So even apparently innocuous nursery rhyme can contain reference, direct implicit reference to plague. So plague was so overwhelming in Europe. And we are talking also about only particularly about England during that period. But well, plague a disease, plague is something which is scary. Plague is something that inevitable, that brings in inevitable death. But Shakespeare goes beyond all these. He uses plague in a very different context. For example, Olivia in Twelfth Night. You all remember that Viola, dressed up as Cesario, goes to Olivia and on behalf of Duke Orsino offers his love. But irony of fate that Olivia falls in love with Cesario, who is actually a woman. And that is how Olivia says, "How now? Even sweetly may one catch the plague, so love is like a plague. Your falling in love is as inevitable as catching a plague. Methinks I feel this in its perfection with an invisible and subtle at mine eyes. Well, let it be. So love is also a plague, which is thoroughly enjoyed. She quite enjoys being infected by the plague of love. Even more interesting reference can be found in Much Ado About Nothing. There, Beatrice, she says, when it comes to be befriended by Benedict, she says, "Oh Lord, he will hang upon him like a disease. He is sooner caught than the pestilence, and yet runs presently mad." So his friendship, his offer of friendship is like a pestilence, a plague. God help the noble Claudio. If he have caught the Benedict, it will cost him £1,000 before he be cured. So, caught the Benedict. Benedict is a proper name. There should not be any article, a definitive article before a proper name. But Beatrice uses it. So, Benedict here is not the person. Benedict here is the pestilence. The name of the pestilence is Benedict itself. So there are myriad ways, mind-boggling ways by which Shakespeare has used the reference to the pestilence in his We go back to Romeo and Juliet because these plays are spread over a long period of time, about 15 years, because I'm referring to Romeo and Juliet, Henry IV Part 1, and Lear, Macbeth, Measure. So what happens in Romeo and Juliet is that Friar Lawrence has added a fellow friar to deliver a crucial message to Romeo that Juliet is not dead, because Romeo was despairing that Juliet is dead. But the Franciscan friars were supposed to move in pairs. So that particular friar had to find another Franciscan friar to travel through the city to reach Romeo. So he says, going to find a barefoot brother out, one of our order to associate me, here in this city, visiting the sick. What is the other fellow doing? He is visiting the sick, people sick with plague. And finding him, the searchers of the town are the civic officials, suspect that both were in a house where the infectious pestilence did reign, sealed up the doors, sent them to quarantine, and could not let us forth, so that my stick to Mantua there was stayed. So they could not deliver their message to Romeo in time, because they were caught by the civic authorities. They were thought to have been infected with plague, and they were sent to quarantine. Whenever I read this section of the play, I inevitably remember a poem by Rabindranath, which is called Obhishar. নগরীর লোকে সে বাসবদত্তাকে আমন্ত্রণ জানিয়েছিল আসার জন্য, উপযুক্ত যাননি। তারপরে বাসবদত্তা যখন দুটি বসন্ত হলো তখন উপযুক্ত দিয়েছিলেন, এবং যখন বাসবদত্তা আমন্ত্রণ জানিয়েছিল তখন উপযুক্ত বলেছিলেন, সময় যখন আসিবে আপনি যাইব তোমার খোঁজে। উপযুক্ত সন্ন্যাসী ছিলেন। So look at these friars, they are also equivalent of সন্ন্যাসী. So I think there is one passage with which everybody is familiar because it occurs in Macbeth, where Shakespeare kind of more directly refers to the play. This is a speech by Ross in the third scene of fourth act. Ross is not talking about the disease. Ross is talking about the situation prevailing in Scotland. And he says, alas, poor country, almost afraid to know itself. It cannot be called our mother, but our grave, where nothing but who knows nothing is once seen to smile, where sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air are met, not mocked, where violent sorrow seems a mortal ecstasy, the dead man's knell is there scarce asked for whom, and good men's lives expired before the flowers in their caps dying, or they are sickened. So very quick death, because the flowers in their caps dry up, people are dead. And you know, Christians, they toll the bells of the parish church whenever anybody in that parish dies. So the bells were ringing continuously without any stop. So that is that kind of tells you the huge number of deaths that were taking place. And as I was telling you, Ross was not talking about plague. Ross was talking about the situation in England. But somehow, interestingly, Macbeth himself becomes the plague. And who is Macbeth? Macbeth is the vicious ruler. So the vicious ruler is also a plague. Look around the world. Look at Brazil. Look at United States of America. Look at Turkey. Look at India. All these vicious rulers are like plagues. And that is exactly what Ross was talking about when he was apparently talking about his own country. You know, the words perfectly capture the experience of living in the inescapable presence of an epidemic disease and hearing constantly the ominous tolling of the church bells. But the strange thing about these lines from Macbeth is that they are not intended as a description of a country in the grip of a vicious plague. Instead, they describe a country in the grip of a vicious ruler. So, in the thought of Ross, Macbeth is also like a I probably can keep on citing any number of lines from Shakespeare to give you an idea how plague has thoroughly informed the thoughts of the bird and how he has translated the epidemic in imageries, indirect references, playing with the words, using it as a verb, using it as a curse, using it as a noun, using it to denote death, using it to denote love as well. Well, I'm not really talking about Daniel Defoe's Diary of the Plague Years. It is the plague of 1665. Defoe has kept a meticulous diary of what was happening in London during that outbreak of plague. This was rather severe. I have already talked about Woodfall because that's a historical novel, and that is how Hilary Mantel kind of captured the era. Now, quickly over to the Spanish flu, which raged between 2018 and 2019. Very recently, I have come across, I have not read the book because it's not as yet available in India. It's available in JSTOR because I'm not in university. I don't have access to JSTOR. I have read snatches of the book and some of the interviews of the author. She's Elizabeth Alba. She's professor of English in the University of Richmond. And uncannily, her book is called Viral Modernism, the Influence of Pandemic and Interwar Literature, which was published in 2019. Uncanny. And she was telling the interviewer, modernist literature, that why is there so little reference to the Spanish flu, which is supposed to have killed about 50 million people in Europe and America in English literature. And then in her study of modernist English literature, she has found Indian references to the pandemic of Spanish flu. Let me tell you, Spanish flu, COVID-19 and Bubonic Plague, they have many things in common, like isolation, like if you can get enough visual images of people wearing masks during 1918, 1920, and how people were dying by the thousands, and how, like Shakespeare, some of the modernist writers actually spoke about their experience of Spanish flu in their literature. Now, I was intrigued by one particular explanation that Professor Autka gave, because that is a poem that I have taught for quite some time. It's a poem, probably is there in the syllabus, undergraduate or postgraduate syllabus, I don't remember. The Second Coming, very familiar poem. And these are the lines: things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. I try to explain it to the students and telling them that it is like many modernist literature, many pieces of modernist literature. It kind of encapsulates and foregrounds Yeats's frustration, agony, desperation after the First World War. But Professor Autka says that no, it has got very direct biographical reference. The weeks immediately preceding Yeats writing this poem, his wife, George, was pregnant at that time, caught the Spanish flu, and George was very close to death. The, the death rate was very high. The Spanish flu death rate was, so far has been the highest. And he was watching his wife very sick, almost on the verge of death. And when she was convalescing, he sat down to write the Second Coming. When you read it through the lens of the pandemic, this other poem begins to emerge. Other poem, that is the viral modernism in the poem. You could see the way such a poem could resonate with people who have experienced this pandemic. The atmosphere, things are falling apart. The center cannot hold. An atmosphere of mere anarchy loosed upon the world. And this blood-dimmed tide is not actually a general reference to blood that was wasted in the battlefields of First World War. Autka argues it can also be. She is not refuting the argument that it is about First World War. It is about First World War, but it can also be about his wife's illness, because one of the most frequent effects of Spanish flu was bleeding from the nose, mouth, and ears, just floods of blood. And then there were the way people drowned in their beds because their lungs were, it was pneumonic. Their lungs were filling up with fluid. So he has a line about the ceremony of innocence being drowned. It may be when it's his wife and unborn baby who were in the process of drowning like that. In Sanskrit, there is a saying, Jabot bachi tabot shikhi. Next time, if ever I teach the Second Coming, I will definitely be talking about this. Another poem that may have been embedded in that very well-known poem of Yeats, which has so far been read as a poem about the First World War. Well, Virginia Woolf was also infected with the flu, and Mrs. Dalloway, she has given a very detailed description of how it feels like being infected by the Spanish flu. It is being infected by Spanish flu is like your life is divided into two halves, that is post-infection and pre-infection, something like the pre-lapsarian and the post-lapsarian world. And if you remember, Mrs. Dalloway had some cardiac problem, which was a result of Spanish flu, and so had Virginia Woolf. Going over to Eliot. Now these lines, in the first section of The Wasteland, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? I would like to argue that definitely Eliot was also writing about the death and devastation of the First World War. But how does one plant a corpse in your garden? Because he was far away from the battlefield. He was in London, but people were dying by the thousands. So a dead body by the roadside was a reality. and probably they didn't have the time to take the dead body to the burial ground. So the body was planted as if it is a seed, planted, that is buried in their own gardens. Probably, Eliot and his wife both were infected by Spanish flu. So one poet, his wife was infected with Spanish flu. One poet, he himself and his wife were infected with Spanish flu. One novelist, she was infected by the Spanish flu. So you can see so many, I should say, not obvious, not telltale, but references to the pandemic which ravaged Europe during these almost 2 years. And in American literature also, you will find references to the Spanish flu. The first group that comes to my mind is Kathleen and Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider. There are several others. But I will wrap up this discussion by a general comment. In the modernist writing, the body, that is the physical human body, becomes the site where biological and cultural ideas contest and mingle. Disease, unlike war, threatening an individual's body. The dark and this is an inscrutable, there is an inscrutable virus lurking in the dark and bringing irreversible damage, change to the body, and subsequently one's perception of the entire world. World finds expression in modernist literature indirectly. So they are not talking about the flu directly, but they are talking about it in their poems, in their novels. There are other references in Westland as well. For example, in the last section, there is reference to the color purple, and because of Spanish flu, human body often turned purple. Just I can read one line from it. And bats with baby faces in the violet light whistle and beat their wings. Couple of lines before that, Eliot writes, "What's the city over the mountains? Cracks and reforms and busts in the violet air." So violet is a color which recurs in Westland, and violet is the color that the body turns when a person is infected with Spanish flu. With this, I move over to Bangla. Is there anybody who doesn't follow Bangla? Is there anybody? I presume none. So I'm reading the original Bengali. This is from a book called Mahasthabir Jatok, written by Premantu. Oh, you don't. I will sum it up for you. First, the privilege of the Bengali speakers. প্রেমাঙ্কুর আতঙ্কে লিখছেন, টালার দাঙ্গা ও ভূমিকম্প হবার কিছু আগে থেকেই আমরা শুনতে পাচ্ছিলাম বোম্বাই অঞ্চলে প্লেগ নামে এক সাংঘাতিক ব্যামোর আবির্ভাব হয়েছে। সেখান থেকে রোগটা বনবন করে কলকাতার দিকে দৌড়ে আসছে। কলকাতায় মহা আতঙ্কের সঞ্চার হলো। ইট ওয়াজ 1898। ইতিমধ্যে একদিন শোনা গেল যে হাওড়ার একটি স্ত্রীলোক বোম্বাই মেলে এসে হাওড়া স্টেশনে একখানা ঠিকে গাড়ি ভাড়া করে কলকাতার দিকে আসছে। হ্যারিসন রোডে এসে গাড়োয়ান তাকে জিজ্ঞেস করলে কোথায় যাবেন। স্ত্রীলোকটি উত্তর দিলেন, আমাকে চিনতে পারছিস না, আমি প্লেগ দেবী। এই বলেই সে গায়েব হয়ে গেল। ব্যাস, আর যাবে কোথায়? শহরময় রব উঠলো, পেলে গো পালা গো। গুজব বিলাসী বাঙালি সন্ত্রস্ত হয়ে পড়লো। বাপ রে বাপ, সে কি ত্রাসের ঘন্টা। So for somebody who doesn't understand Bangla, here is a Bengali novel from which I am quoting, where the novelist describes how in 1898 plague reached Calcutta and the panic that it caused among the residents of the city. And as it happened in Decameron, in the case of Boccaccio, as it happened in the Elizabethan and Tudor England, exactly that is what happened in Kolkata. People who were rich enough left Kolkata for the same reason. It is dirty, it is dingy, social isolation is difficult, the infection spread rapidly. So those who could afford, they left Kolkata. Couple of lines later, কর্পোরেশন শহরবাসীদের প্লেগের টিকে নেবার জন্য অনুরোধ করতে লাগলো। প্লেগের হাসপাতাল তৈরি হলো মেছো বাজারের মার্কাস স্কোয়ার। And most people, the corporation insisted on injecting plague vaccine, but most people they rejected. And the people who gave themselves, rather offered themselves for the experimentation, were the Brahmos, because they were enlightened people. Among them were the family of Kadambini Ganguly, Darpanath Ganguly, and the family of the author also. He writes, মাস ছয়েক বাদে কর্পোরেশন থেকে আমাদের নামে একখানা কার্ড এলো, সেগুলো হলো সার্টিফিকেট, অর্থাৎ প্লেগ হলে সেগুলো দেখালে আর কোয়ারেন্টাইনে ধরে নিতে যাবে না। So they were issued certificates to the effect that they have been given plague vaccine, and if there is another outbreak in the city, outbreak of plague in the city, they will not be sent to quarantine. Very, very similar to what is happening right now. Next, I go over to শ্রীকান্ত দ্বিতীয় পর্ব। শরৎচন্দ্র লিখছেন, জাহাজ যে কখন আসিয়া ঘাটে ভিড়িবে সে জাহাজই জানে। সহসা চাহিয়া দেখি এই 1400-1500 লোক ইতিমধ্যে তখন ভেড়ার পালের মতন সার বাঁধিয়া দাঁড়াইয়া গেছে। একজন হিন্দুস্থানীকে জিজ্ঞাসা করিলাম, বাপু বেশ তো সকলে বসেছিলেন, হঠাৎ এমন কাতার দিয়া দাঁড়ালে কেন? সে কহিল, দগদরি হোগা। দগদরি পদার্থটি কি বাপু? লোকটা পিছনের একটা ঠেলা সামলাইয়া বিরক্ত মুখে কহিল, আরে প্লেগ কা দগদরি। পরে একজনকে প্রশ্ন করে, জানায় এখনো প্লেগ যায় না, তাই এই
ইয়েটা দেখি এরকম কথা কেন কে মিউট করে রাখছে, ভিডিও সবাই অফ করে রাখছে।
হ্যালো,
who is actually everyone please mute your microphones, everyone other than the speaker, that is.
So Pilek ka Dagdari was actually checking for plague, and Sharotchandra gives a very detailed description how the English doctors came and how uncomfortable it was for the people, because they were putting their hands inside the clothes, feeling for swollen glands in the armpit and in the groin. That is he is talking about Bubonic Plague. পরদিন বেলা 11টা-12টার মধ্যে জাহাজ রেঙ্গুন পৌঁছিবে, কিন্তু ভোর না হইতে সমস্ত লোকের মুখে চোখে একটা ভয় ও চাঞ্চল্যের চিহ্ন দেখা গেল। চারিদিক হইতে একটা অস্ফুট শব্দ কানে আসিতে লাগিল, কেরেন্টিন কেরেন্টিন, that is quarantine. And actually Sharotchandra gives description how when the this is Sharotchandra দ্বিতীয় পর্ব, শ্রীকান্ত দ্বিতীয় পর্ব, written by Sharotchandra Chattopadhyay. So he has given description how these people who came by the ship, they were sent to makeshift huts, city of were quarantined there for 2 weeks before they were allowed to move over to the city. And incidentally, by now everybody knows that quarantine is the Italian for 40, and because the ships were quarantined for 40 days before the inmates of the ship were allowed to come into the city, that is why quarantine, whether it lasts for 7 days, 14 days, 21 days or 40 days, it has got the English word quarantine. Okay. I must say there are not too many references to plague in Bengali literature, because plague probably did not wreak the havoc that it did in Europe. So there is reference to plague in Choturango by Rabindranath. Jathamashai died of plague. In fact, Sharatchandra's wife and daughter, Abanindranath's young daughter, they all died of plague. About the Spanish influenza, I didn't find, probably there is one reference in Sharatchandra, any other reference in Bangla. But there is something very interesting. Rabindranath in 1919 was writing from Shantiniketan. I'm reading out part of the letter in Bangla. বৌমার খুব কঠিন রকম নিউমোনিয়া হয়েছিল। স্প্যানিশ ফ্লু ডিড ইনডিউস নিউমোনিয়া। অনেকদিন লড়াই করে কাল থেকে ভালো আছেন। সম্পূর্ণ সুস্থ হতে বোধহয় অনেকদিন লাগবে। হেমলতা এবং সুকেশী এখনো ভুগছেন। তার মধ্যে হেমলতা প্রায় সেরে উঠেছেন, কিন্তু সুকেশীর জন্য ভাবনার কারণ আছে। কিন্তু ছেলেদের মধ্যে একটিরও ইনফ্লুয়েঞ্জা হয়নি। আমার বিশ্বাস তার কারণ আমি ওদের বরাবর পঞ্চতীর্থ 5 জন খাইয়ে আসছি। So you see that what affected Pratima Devi, Boma, is influenza, and it was 1990. So Rabindranath was definitely talking about Spanish influenza, and about Hemlata and Shukeshi, probably they were also affected by influenza. You know, something in a lighter mode, Tagore, in spite of all his achievements, imagine that he could be a doctor also. He actually administered homeopathic medicine, and Panchatikta is a kind of concoction of 5 bitter leaves like Gulancho, neem, and he made a concoction of these 5 bitter leaves, and each and every inmate of Shantiniketan ashram at that point of time, young boys, they were administered that in the empty stomach, and Tagore believed that because of this Panchatikta, the boys were not infected with Spanish flu. But you know, there are references to epidemics in Bangla: cholera, malaria, smallpox. But Spanish flu, I don't remember a single reference in Bengali. Probably Kolkata was not as hard hit as, say, New York, and that is why it has largely been glossed over. We have plethora of visual representation of dead bodies piling up, people wearing masks from the USA, from Europe, but I haven't seen any such visual representation in India, for that matter, during this pandemic of Spanish flu in 1918-19 and to some extent in 1920. This is how I end my presentation. Thank you so much for giving me such a patient hearing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And it was a lot of illumination on a very dark subject, which you did with aplomb and with the kind of lucidity that comes with the kind of experience and the kind of erudition that you have after all these years as a professor. And thank you. And we wish to, sort of express our gratitude in no uncertain terms for the brilliant session that you went through right now. And as all good things, sort of have their point of ending, but things always continue in our mental sphere, that is. And so it's time, I think, for the audience, that is the audience and the participants on the YouTube and our very well used Google Meet platform, to put forward the queries and the questions that inevitably arise after such a lucid and relevant topic. So it's time for questions. Every one of you, every one of us are quite, free to put up questions on the chat box, or if possible, on the YouTube line. That is, it's better on the chat box. That is, so it's time for the question answer session. And please, well, there we have one. It's from Zainab. Do you see superstition and misinformation that used to be a part of society during the 19th century during pandemics still be a part of our society? It's there.
Yes, it's very much there. You can see for yourself. This morning, I have been advised to take turmeric powder with milk to prevent infection of COVID-19. We have so much misinformation in the social media, in various other platforms, because even the scientists and doctors, they don't know for sure how the pandemic spreads. So there are so many theories, and since there is no definite body of scientific knowledge, there are bound to be misinformations and superstitions. It's there now.
Ma'am, there's one question. Actually, it's a query that I have had for a time, because all these times we have been reading these materials on the Great Plague and all that. Ma'am, did any significant scientific breakthrough happen after the Black Death of the 14th century?
It took a long time. Today, the plague is curable with doses of penicillin. But
Yes.
it is only in the 19th century that the bacteria of plague was isolated. During the plague, there was no cure.
Yes.
Now it's there.
It's there, yeah. Actually, I think it's probably the miasma theory that was prevalent. That is the bad air from rotting things.
All kinds of things. That is why people were carrying oranges, rosemaries, they were burning shoes. And miasma theory, there was the theory of God's curse. All
Yes,
kinds of theories. And not that people are not talking about God's curse right now. If you go through posts in various platforms of social media, you will find people talking about these things, most irrational things.
Yes. So actually, we are walking backwards in a way.
Well, at least replicating what happened in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century.
Yes, that is. Yeah, anyone, any questions? Well, there is another question from... There's another question. Is the COVID-19 pandemic going to dominate the 21st century literary domain as did the bubonic plague in the 14th century?
It's very difficult to say. Very difficult to say. How can I predict future? But I hope such a devastating experience of humanity should not go unrepresented in literature, and I believe it will not.
Yeah, that sure is. And any more questions? There's another question there. Is there any Indian English poet, author, who mentioned this kind of issue in his her writings? I think that's been answered anyway, but...
Well, the Spanish flu? Which pandemic?
It isn't specified.
No, I have mentioned at the beginning that Christian Church kept records of births and deaths. That is why we know today how many people died. In India, we never had this system. So whether there was a bubonic plague in the 14th, 15th centuries in India, we do not know for sure. But researchers have claimed that the plague originated in Asia and traveled to Europe through trade routes, which is India, China, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt. But we don't know. We don't have records.
Well, there's another question about Indian writers who have written about pandemics.
Pandemics per se, I don't remember because we don't have any record about the Bubonic Plague pandemic. I can't read any other Indian language. I can read only Bangla. In Bangla, there is not too many references to the Bubonic Plague pandemic or Spanish flu pandemic. There are a few which I have already mentioned, but epidemics are there, galore. 101 references to the epidemic. Malaria, cholera, smallpox. Bangla is replete with references for this. But since they were only epidemics and not pandemics, I didn't include these in my presentation. How did Durga die in Pothe Pachari? Malaria epidemic. And there are plenty. You can start counting and the night will be over.
Yeah, and there is Kulani in Mallodan. She also died of malaria.
Died of plague. Yes, plague.
That's plague.
Plague. Kulani died of plague.
Plague. So there are a number of references actually.
Yeah, plague there are, but not as wide and as deep as we find it in English literature, because as Premankur Atokthi has commented in this novel, plague did not take off properly in Kolkata. So some people died, but what is the number? Nothing like 20 million or 50 million. Isn't it? Far more people died in the famine.
No, it was not like.
So if you go back to Bangla literature, you will find plenty of references to the Montagues, because that was very much a real experience for each and everybody across the social stratum. And Bubonic pandemic or Spanish flu pandemic was not. That is why there is not so many references and so wide representation in Bangla literature. Epidemic is there.
Any more questions? Anyone?
Hello.
Yeah, there's. Yes, Nipanjan.
Actually, in the YouTube, there is a question that is put by Dr. Sushant Kumar Sahu. And he writes, do you agree Rebati is a character in Odia literature in representation of COVID-19 pandemic crisis?
Problem is I have not read it. I don't know.
Yes, probably it's a Odia literature. And
Odia literature, I have not read it. So I don't know.
Okay, there is nothing from YouTube section.
Right. Shall we wait or?
No. You can move.
Of course. Yes. Well, then there's the next part of our webinar. That's mainly the Thanksgiving, the valedictory session, which will be chaired by Dr. Bhaskar Chatterjee who is our IQA coordinator. And I'd like to sort of pass the mic to Dr. Bhaskar Chatterjee. Bhaskar, please.
Thank you, Rupen. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. We got hear your line clear.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. So it's really a pleasure for me to thank everyone on behalf of IQAC who have participated in this webinar organized by the Department of English. At the outset, I, on behalf of IQAC Nabadwip Vidyasagar College, would like to thank our distinguished speaker for the day, Professor Sharmila Majumdar, who is an associate professor in the Department of English, University of Kalyani. I really thank her for taking her valuable time being with us today and delivering such an illuminating and interesting lecture and deliberation in front of us in the context of pandemic and literature. I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Shapan Kumar Roy, and president of our governing body, Sri Biman Krishna Shah, for their constant support and encouragement in organizing all these kinds of seminars. I would like to thank all our participants who have come forward to join with us to make it successful today. And finally, I thank all our organizers of this webinar, all the faculty members of the Department of English, Dr. Arun Kumar Bishwas, Professor Piyush Bhadro, Professor Rupen Mondol, Professor Dipanjan Ghosh, who have constantly strived their best to make it successful, and the technical support team, of course, headed by Professor Ms. Shravanti Das, Professor Sudipta Modok, Professor Shubhajit Sen, and Sri Omolendu Das, who have constantly dedicated, and their efforts have made it successful to make this webinar. And finally, I thank you all for your patience hearing. Thank you.
Well, it's raining thanks, and Bhaskodda, that was a nice little act of gratitude on your part.
Thank you.
And we, sort of appreciate that very much. So there isn't any more questions right now, and I think our webinar has come to its logical conclusion. And before we sign off, once again, above everything, I'd like to express my gratitude once again to our honorable speaker. That was a huge amount of illumination on a very, very grim kind of text and context. Thank you, ma'am, for sort of showing us that even though the COVID has stopped everything, it cannot stop the march of learning, research, and literature. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. You gave me the opportunity to go back to the Shakespearean texts after a long time. Thank you.
Thank you.